All right, April the 1st, we are calling Impossible Sunday. And leading up to April 1st, over the next few Sunday mornings, we are going to be looking at events that happened in the life of Jesus leading up to April 1st, which would have been the day, at least on our calendar this year, of His resurrection. And that was, to man, what seemed to be an incredibly impossible event. Jesus resurrected from the dead, conquering death, bringing us the gift of eternal life, something that we can truly rejoice, right? So, leading up to that Sunday, as we talk through the life of Jesus, He travels that week in Jerusalem. But on that day, we're also calling it Impossible Sunday because there's another thing we'd like to do that day that almost looks like it's almost that impossible, but not quite, is we would like everybody in our church roll to be here for Easter Sunday. Now, I know some of you might be traveling, we understand that, but if you are in town, if you know people are in town, we would love to see this building just completely packed on Easter Sunday. So look around, and if you don't see a friend or a neighbor or someone you should see, make sure you invite them. Go out and invite your friends, invite your neighbors, invite people you haven't seen in a while, and let's celebrate the resurrection of Jesus on April the 1st. You know also that this year, that Easter and April Fool's Day are the same day. I don't know how often that happens, but it happens this time, so that's where we are. Most people think that as long as you go to church, God's pretty happy. I mean, we'll assemble on a Sunday morning, maybe for about an hour. We'll sing some songs. We'll offer up some prayers. We'll partake in the Lord's Supper to remember the death, burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. We'll have a collection, put some money in the plate. Hey, listen to a sermon. And then we leave and we think, well, everything's good. We went to church. I mean, look in the world, all the people who don't go to church, right? God has got to be happier with people who go to church than people who don't go to church. And there's a huge danger there. Because if you compare yourself to something else, you can always find something that you think that's worse than you to compare yourself to. But just because you compare yourself to something that looks worse than what you are, doesn't mean that you're good. So the question becomes, can God ever really be unhappy with church? And the answer to that question is yes. God can be unhappy with church. Going to church is not always an indicator of spiritual maturity. If you do not honor God with your life, I don't think you're any better sitting in church than sitting at home. God's not looking for people who perform a ritual. God's not looking for people who just show up at a particular time because of habit. God is looking for people who worship Him with their heart. And if you do not give your heart to Jesus, if you do not give your heart to God, just assembling in church without having the heart for God is, in reality, it's almost detestable to God. Right after Jesus' triumphal entry on the next day, He illustrates that by two incredible events. Matthew and Mark mention the cursing of the fig tree. There's no mention of that event in either Luke or John. So let's read from Mark. The next day as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry, and seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, He went to find out if it had any fruit. And when He reached it, He found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. Then He said to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And the disciples heard Him say it. Later in Mark chapter 11, we find out what happened. When evening came, they went out of the city. In the morning as they went along, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. And Peter remembered and said to Jesus, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered." Why did Jesus curse a fig tree for not having figs when it wasn't even the time for figs? I mean, Jesus is omniscient, right? He knows everything. I mean, don't you think he knew that the tree didn't have figs before he got to the tree? I mean, what sense does that make? Why did he kill it? Well, it's 1st of April in Palestine. And there are fig trees. Fig trees start to come out in bloom in usually late March. They start to leaf out. As they leaf out, there are some figs that appear with the leaves or sometimes before the leaves, and they're usually ready to harvest, ready to eat. They're ripe in May or June. The larger figs that start to grow from the new sprouts that come out in the spring, you don't eat those until August to October. So at this time, the 1st of April, there is no time for the figs. Now this is a picture of a fig tree as it starts to get leaves. Now as it starts to get leaves in the spring, do you notice anything about that branch? It has some early figs. Because in a lot of ways the early figs would appear before the leaves would appear. Or at least they would appear simultaneously with the leaves. So Jesus walks along and he sees this fig tree that is in leaf. If it's in leaf, it should have early figs. It was something special, the fact that it already had leaves. So if you went up to that tree, you would expect, even though it was early, since it's in full leaf, you would expect to find a fig. Because the fig tree is a perfect lesson for what is going to happen to Jesus this week in Jerusalem. He is going to encounter people who promise him much, but they don't deliver. He is going to have interaction with Pharisees and Sadducees and teachers of the law and the general people of Israel. Just the day before, they've shouted, "He's the king," right? Thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are going to come to Passover in Jerusalem to claim their devotion for God. And very few are going to recognize Jesus as the Passover lamb. Very few are going to understand who Jesus is. It's his last week of life in the flesh, and most people who are so loudly proclaiming their devotion to God would shout, "Crucify him," before the week was over. They were like a luxurious, leafy fig tree that had no figs. It looked like they were promising. On the outside, it looked as if they were devoted to God, but they were going to miss his son. They're going to crucify him on a cross. After Jesus cursed that fig tree, he left and he went into the temple. The temple is a very spacious, enormous building. This is a virtual model of it. It's not anything like that we can take a picture of anymore. That big court that you see inside those larger outside walls is called the Court of the Gentiles. In that Court of the Gentiles, that's where Jesus would have found people buying and selling and exchanging money. If you were Jew or Gentile, you were welcome inside that larger outside court. You can't see it in this. It's just kind of a brief line in there, but there's about a 4.5 foot tall wall on the inside before you get to that center part. That's the real temple area. And in that 4.5 foot wall, there was a warning that was on a stone. It said, "Let no man of another nation enter inside the barrier and fence around the temple. Whoever is caught will have himself to blame that his death follows." So if you were a Gentile, you could go in that outer court, but not inside that wall and not into the court of women. Buying, selling, exchanging. Then when you first read that, you can kind of understand the people who were selling and exchanging, can't you? I mean, it's lucrative business. You're coming to Jerusalem for the Passover. You're going to offer a sacrifice. A couple of options. You can bring it from home. So if you're traveling a long distance to get there, you can bring your animal with you. So I don't know that I would really want to carry an animal if I had to travel very, very far. The other thing you could do when you got there is you could buy it. You could go in and you could buy an animal for your sacrifice, and for the convenience of having an animal there was usually kind of a greatly inflated, profitable cost. You might come from another part of the world. You might have Roman money or Greek money. You might even have Egyptian money. But when you get to the temple, you have to pay the half-shekel temple tax with Jewish currency. So you would have to exchange your money. Anybody had to exchange money when you went to another country? There's a fee attached to that, right? Well, they were attaching a fee to it. So we'll swap your money over, but it's going to cost you. So it's lucrative. It's big business. And you can just imagine the hustle and the bustle of all the things that are going on, and people coming in and going out and getting ready for Passover and getting their sacrifice, and supply and demand, right? And so they're making their money. And Jesus enters. And he entered the temple area and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. See, the temple had also become a shortcut. If you want to go to the city, to the Mount of Olives, you can walk around, or you can cut through the temple. You could cut through there to go to a couple of other places because there were gates on the sides. So it's not only that they were passing through and going into the temple for their religious purposes, but it became a shortcut. And I'm sure that Jesus saw people carrying all kind of things through that temple that was supposed to be holy and the place where God's name would dwell. And as he saw them going through, it broke his heart, using its purpose. How about those buying? I mean, they sound kind of innocent, don't they? But he ran them out. Maybe it just become a matter of convenience. Maybe instead of carrying your animal there, or maybe instead of having to do something that was a little bit out of place, or a little bit hard, or a little bit difficult, maybe it was just easier to show up and buy one from the temple guys. And Jesus enters there and he drives all of them out. And he says this. And he taught them and said, "Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations? But you have made it a den of robbers." Even the rabbis disagreed with those who would just kind of pass in and out of the temple. They wrote in some Jewish law. "What reverence is due the temple? That no one go into the mountain of the house with his staff, shoes, purse, or dust on his feet. Let no one make a crossing through it or degrade it into a place of spitting." So the lesson, I think, there is that when the practice of so-called religion becomes nothing but just a means to what people are really interested in, kind of convenience, social advancement, financial gain, there is nothing left of real, true devotion. And we can become very much like those who were in the temple. We can show up at church for all the wrong reasons. Maybe it's a social connection. Maybe it's to think that God will rescue us from something that we faced. Maybe it's so we can feel good about ourselves. Maybe it's so we can impress other people. Maybe it's so somebody else will think good of us. The question is, do you have deep devotion for God? Jesus quotes prophecy from Isaiah. and foreigners who bind themselves to the Lord to serve Him, to love the name of the Lord, and to worship Him, all who keep the Sabbath without desecrating it, and who hold fast to my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain and give them joy for my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. And I tell you that I boldly stand before you here today as a child of God because of that prophecy. Because, like many of you, I'm one of those that God called from all nations to be His child. So I want you to leave here thinking about two things. One is, don't be a leafy, luxuriant fig tree without any figs. Don't promise God a lot but deliver nothing. They went to the temple. They lacked devotion. They celebrated the feast. They lacked devotion. They offered sacrifices on the altar. They lacked devotion. They put money in the temple treasury. They lacked devotion. Are you committed to being a follower of Jesus? Does He have your heart? Because that's when God is unhappy with just showing up at church. If we're showing up, but we don't have hearts who are devoted to God, then God is looking at us thinking, what are you doing? So we don't spectate, we participate. We become involved. We don't come to just sit in a pew, we come to serve God. We don't come just for relationship with others, but we combine that relationship with others with our relationship with Jesus. We encourage. We build up. We strengthen. We nurture God's church. We push each other toward good service. We spur one another on toward good deeds. We try to understand each other. We try to build each other up. I don't want you to come and just sit in a pew and think that by showing up for an hour on a Sunday morning, then everything in your heart is okay with God. Do you remember that temple? That huge, incredible building up on the Temple Mount. So magnificent, isn't it? Where's God's temple? Is it these walls? This roof? No. See, I think the lesson of the temple is pretty simple. Be holy because I am holy. There's a holiness, a reverence. It's not in dress. It's not by what we wear. It's not by where we assemble that we build some huge, great, incredible building to God. It is our heart and our passion and our will and our life. You are the temple of God. God's Spirit dwells in you. Got anything in the temple that you need to throw out? Do you have anything living in God's house that shouldn't be there? What is deep in your emotions and your feelings and your thoughts and your desires and your action? Is it a house of prayer? Are you able to come before God and praise Him for who He is? Jesus is going to walk in Jerusalem for a week. He is going to be criticized. He's going to be questioned. He's going to be turned on. He's going to be denied. He's going to be rebuked. He's going to be crucified. And He says, those who are going to do that to me is like this fig tree. It's full of leaves. It's full of promise. But when He gets there and He looks at that tree, it's empty. And they are going to be like huge Temple Mount that is bustling and looks like it is the most incredible thing on the face of the earth. And people from all over are going to flock to this temple to worship God on this Passover weekend. But those that are inside it are lacking devotion for God. And they are going to miss the greatest gift that God ever gave the world. Don't be a fig tree without figs. And don't be like a person who proclaims devotion for God but isn't really devoted. Make your temple holy. Honor God with every breath, with every thought, with everything that you do, and approach God with a passion to know who He is. If you need to respond in some way to the invitation, I would ask you to do that while we stand and sing.